Funny how the loudest people in the room are usually the ones with the least to say when it finally matters. The chandelier above the ballroom cast a golden glow over polished marble floors, the kind that reflected not just light, but status, power, and carefully curated lives, and right at the center of it all stood Sophia Bennett, her fingers gently resting on her son's shoulder as if anchoring herself to something real in a room full of performance, her dress simple, navy blue, nothing that demanded attention, and yet somehow she felt every eye land on her the moment she stepped inside. Not because she belonged, but because they had already decided she didn't, the quiet murmurs beginning like a ripple in still water, soft at first, then growing sharper, more defined, until they turned into glances, then whispers. Then smiles that didn't quite hide the judgment behind them, and across the room, Ryan Cole stood with a glass of champagne in hand, his tailored suit fitting like a second skin, confidence radiating off him as easily as breath. His arm loosely draped around a woman who looked like she had never known a difficult day in her life, her laughter light, practiced, effortless, and when his eyes found Sophia, there was a flicker, recognition, satisfaction, something colder than either. Before his lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and just like that, the room seemed to shift, conversations slowing, attention narrowing, as if everyone instinctively sensed something about to unfold. Sophia felt her son's hand tighten around hers, small fingers curling into her palm, and she glanced down at him, offering a soft smile, the kind that said everything would be okay even when she wasn't entirely sure herself. But she straightened anyway, shoulders back, chin level. Her composure the only armor she had ever allowed herself to wear. Ryan took a slow sip of his drink before setting it aside, then began walking toward her, each step deliberate, unhurried, as though the distance between them was something he intended to savor. And when he finally stopped, just a few feet away, the silence around them was no longer subtle, it was complete, heavy. Expectant, Sophia, he said, her name rolling off his tongue like it belonged to a story he had already finished telling. I didn't think you'd actually come. His voice carried just enough to reach those nearby, just enough to invite their attention without seeming to ask for it, and a few quiet chuckles followed, polite, restrained, but unmistakable. Sophia met his gaze, her expression calm, unreadable. It's a school event, she replied softly, her tone even. I'm here for my son, Ryan's smile widened slightly, as if amused by the simplicity of her answer, as if it confirmed exactly what he wanted everyone to believe. Of course, he said, nodding, then glancing briefly at the boy beside her. Still doing everything on your own, I see. The words landed lightly, almost casually, but the implication beneath them was anything but. A few people exchanged looks, someone let out a quiet laugh, and Sophia felt the weight of it, not just the words, but the judgment wrapped inside them. The years condensed into a single moment, every sacrifice, every late night, every silent decision to keep going, reduced to something that could be dismissed in a sentence. Her son shifted beside her, and without thinking, she adjusted his collar, smoothing it gently, her movements precise, unhurried, as though the world around her had faded into something distant, something unimportant, and for a brief second, her eyes flickered, not with anger, not with hurt, but with something far quieter, far more dangerous, a stillness that didn't need to defend itself, because it wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. Ryan watched her, waiting, expecting a reaction, a crack, anything that would justify the narrative he had already built. But she said nothing, and that silence stretched, filling the space between them in a way words never could. The crowd leaned in without realizing it, drawn to the tension, to the imbalance, to the unspoken question hanging in the air, and Sophia simply looked at him, not as someone beneath him, not as someone broken, but as someone who had already walked through everything he thought defined her, and for the first time, there was the faintest shift in his expression, subtle, almost imperceptible, but real, because something about her presence didn't match the story he had been telling, and he couldn't quite place why. The silence did not break all at once, it thinned slowly, like tension dissolving into polite conversation as if nothing had happened. But the glances lingered, subtle and sharp, following Sophia as she guided her son toward the refreshment table. Her hand steady on his shoulder, her posture unchanged, and yet there was a quiet awareness in the way she moved, as if she could feel every whisper even when she could not hear the words, and behind her, Ryan exhaled a soft laugh, the kind meant more. For the audience then for himself, turning slightly toward the small circle that had gathered around him. Some things never change, he said lightly, picking up his glass again, his tone smooth, effortless, and the woman beside him leaned in just enough to be seen. Her smile curious, almost entertained. "You did not tell me she would actually show up," she murmured, and Ryan shrugged, a small motion that carried too much meaning. "I suppose everyone likes to pretend they still belong somewhere." He replied, his voice low but not low enough, and a few nods followed, the kind that required no commitment, only agreement with the mood of the moment. Across the room, Sophia handed her son a cup of juice, crouching slightly so she could meet his eyes. Her voice soft, steady. "Stay close to me, okay?" she said, brushing a stray strand of hair from his forehead, and he nodded, though his gaze drifted back toward Ryan, confusion flickering across his young face, the kind that comes from witnessing something you do not yet have the words to understand. And Sophia noticed it, of course she did, but she only smiled again, a little gentler this time, as if shielding him from something invisible, as if absorbing the weight so he would not have to carry it. And when she stood, she caught her reflection briefly in the polished surface of a nearby column, the navy fabric of her dress, the simplicity of it, the absence of anything designed to impress. And for a second, a memory surfaced uninvited, the version of herself who used to stand in front of mirrors much larger than this, adjusting dresses that cost more than a month of rent, preparing for events where Ryan's name opened doors and her presence completed the picture. She remembered the way people used to greet her then. The warmth, the attention, the assumption that she mattered simply because she was beside him, and the memory did not hurt the way it once did. It did not sting or ache. It simply existed, distant, like something that belonged to another life entirely. And as she turned away from her reflection, a voice interrupted the quiet she had created for herself. "Sophia." It was one of the other parents, a woman whose name she barely recalled, her smile polite but edged with curiosity. "I did not realize you would be attending tonight." And there it was again, not quite a question, not quite a welcome, just an observation wrapped in something else, something that measured and categorized. Sophia inclined her head slightly. "My son is part of the program," she replied, her tone even, and the woman nodded, glancing briefly toward Ryan before returning her attention. "Of course," she said, though her expression suggested there was more she could say if she chose to, and for a moment, the two of them stood there, suspended in that familiar social balance where one person waits for the other to fill the silence, to explain, to justify, to offer more than what was asked. But Sophia did not. She simply held the space as it was, unaltered, unexpanded, and eventually, the woman's smile tightened just enough to signal retreat. "Well, enjoy the evening," she added, before stepping away, and as the distance between them grew, Sophia felt it again, that subtle shift inside her. Not anger, not embarrassment, but clarity, the kind that settles quietly and does not need to announce itself. And across the room, Ryan watched her once more, his gaze narrowing slightly, not because she had said anything remarkable, but because she had not, because she had not played the role he had expected, and somewhere beneath his composed exterior, there was the faintest trace of unease, as if the story he had been telling about her no longer fit quite as perfectly as it once had. The program began with a soft chime that echoed through the ballroom, a gentle signal that attention should shift, that whatever quiet tensions had been building in corners and conversations should now be folded neatly away. And as people turned toward the small stage set at the far end of the room, the lights dimmed just enough to guide their focus, leaving everything else in a warm, muted glow, Sophia felt her son's hand slip into hers again, his grip a little firmer this time. And she gave it a reassuring squeeze before guiding him closer to the front, not too close, just enough so he could see without being seen too much. And as they found their place, she became aware of Ryan moving again, his presence cutting through the crowd with the same practiced ease. His voice carrying lightly as he greeted donors and organizers, shaking hands, exchanging smiles, the version of him that always knew exactly how to belong in rooms like this, and for a moment, their paths aligned once more. Not by accident, but by design, because he chose it, because he always did. You stayed, he said, stopping beside her, his tone almost conversational, almost neutral, but there was something beneath it, something probing. As if he were still trying to understand why she had not left when it would have been easier. Sophia did not turn immediately, her gaze still on the stage where a group of children were lining up, adjusting their outfits, whispering to each other with nervous excitement, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady. "My son is performing," she said, as if that alone explained everything, and perhaps it did. Ryan followed her gaze briefly, nodding once, then let out a quiet breath. "You always were good at staying for the parts that mattered," he replied, and for the first time, there was no laughter around them, no audience leaning in to catch the exchange, just the low hum of anticipation as the program prepared to begin. Sophia turned then, meeting his eyes fully, and there was no challenge in her expression, no need to argue or defend, only a stillness that seemed to absorb his words without reacting to them, and that unsettled him more than anything she could have said, because it gave him nothing to push against, nothing to reshape, and for a second, the version of her he remembered, the one who used to respond, to explain, to try, flickered in his mind. But it did not match the woman standing in front of him now, and he could feel that difference without being able to name it. The music began softly, a piano melody that filled the space between them, and the children stepped forward one by one, small voices rising carefully, imperfect but sincere, and Sophia's attention shifted completely, her focus narrowing to a single point, her son among them, his posture straight, his expression determined, and as he began to sing, her features softened in a way that nothing else in the room could have caused, pride, quiet and unwavering, settling into her like something permanent, something no one could take from her. And Ryan watched her then, not the stage, not the crowd, but her, as if trying to reconcile this version of her with the one he had convinced himself he understood, and in that moment, he realized something that did not sit comfortably, that whatever he thought she had lost, whatever he believed she no longer was, it had not diminished her in the way he expected. If anything, it had refined her into something quieter, steadier, something that did not need the room's approval to exist, and as the applause began to rise, filling the ballroom with warmth and recognition for the children on stage, Sophia joined in, her hands moving gently, her eyes still fixed on her son, and for the first time that evening, the attention around her shifted, not because of what she lacked, but because of the calm certainty she carried. And though no one could quite explain it, there was a subtle change in the way the room held her now, as if something unseen had begun to turn. The applause lingered a moment longer than expected, warm and genuine, echoing softly against the high ceilings before fading into a comfortable hum of conversation, and as the children stepped down from the stage, their laughter and excitement filling the space where tension had once quietly lived, Sophia knelt slightly as her son hurried toward her, his face lit with a kind of pride that needed no validation, and she met him with a smile that felt effortless, her hand brushing gently against his cheek as she whispered something only he could hear, something that made his shoulders relax, something that reminded him he had done more than enough, and for a brief moment, the world outside of that small exchange did not exist, not the ballroom, not the whispers, not even Ryan. Just the quiet certainty between a mother and her child, and when she stood again, there was a shift in her posture so subtle it could easily be missed, but it was there, a steadiness that did not come from holding herself together, but from no longer needing to. And as the evening continued, the program transitioned into its next phase, a series of acknowledgments and speeches meant to honor donors and contributors, the kind of segment where names carried weight and recognition was currency, and Sophia guided her son toward a nearby table, settling into a seat at the edge of the room, not hidden, but not seeking attention either, her presence quiet, composed, while across the ballroom, Ryan had already returned to his element, stepping onto the stage with practiced confidence, adjusting the microphone slightly as he greeted the audience, his voice smooth and controlled, filling the room with ease. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, offering a smile that had been perfected over years of moments just like this. And as he spoke about community, generosity, and opportunity, the crowd listened with polite attention, nodding at the right moments, responding with light applause when prompted, and yet, beneath the surface, there was a subtle current that had not been there before, something unspoken, something that lingered from earlier, and though Ryan did not acknowledge it, he felt it, a slight resistance, a fraction of the room that no longer responded to him with the same unquestioned admiration, and his gaze drifted, almost unconsciously, scanning the crowd until it found her again, seated calmly, her attention divided between the stage and her son beside her, not watching him in the way others were, not measuring or reacting, simply existing within the moment without attaching herself to it, and for reasons he could not fully articulate, that unsettled him more than any confrontation could have. Because it suggested a distance he had not created, a space between them that he could not control, and as the speech continued, he shifted slightly, adjusting his tone, his words, as if trying to reclaim something that had quietly moved out of reach. While at the table, Sophia reached for a glass of water, her movements unhurried, her gaze steady, and for a fleeting second, a memory surfaced again, not of loss this time, but of a beginning, a small apartment filled with second-hand furniture. Late nights spent studying while her son slept nearby, the soft glow of a laptop screen illuminating determination instead of doubt, the quiet decision she had made back then, not to prove anyone wrong, but to rebuild something that belonged entirely to her. And as the present settled back into place, she exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried no weight, no urgency, just clarity, and somewhere in the distance, beyond the rhythm of applause and conversation, there was the faintest sense that this evening was not unfolding the way anyone had expected, not because of something loud or dramatic, but because of something far quieter, something that had already begun to change the balance of the room without asking for permission. The evening settled into a quieter rhythm as the formal program began to give way to conversations and movement, the kind that filled the room with a low, constant energy, glasses lightly clinking, voices overlapping just enough to blur into a soft background hum, and Sophia remained seated for a moment longer, watching her son laugh with a few other children nearby, his earlier tension completely gone, replaced by something lighter, something free. And she allowed herself to take that in, the simple, undeniable proof that she had done something right, that despite everything, he was growing up untouched by the weight that had once threatened to define their lives, and as she stood, smoothing the fabric of her dress instinctively, she felt it again, that subtle awareness, the sense that eyes still followed her, though differently now, less dismissive, more curious, as if something about her no longer fit the assumptions people had quietly made, and she moved through the space with measured ease. Not avoiding anyone, not seeking anyone either, simply present, until a voice, unfamiliar but steady, reached her just as she paused near the edge of the ballroom. "Miss Bennet," it said, and she turned slightly, her expression composed, to find a man standing a few feet away, his posture relaxed, his presence understated in a way that did not demand attention yet somehow held it, his suit simple, perfectly tailored, his gaze direct but not intrusive. "I hope I am not interrupting," he added, his tone calm, almost thoughtful, and for a brief moment, Sophia searched her memory, but there was no immediate recognition, no context to place him within. "I do not believe we have met," she replied, her voice even, and he inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the distance between them. "Ethan Blake," he said, offering nothing more than his name. No title, no explanation, just enough to exist within the moment without defining it, and there was something about that. Something in the restraint that made her pause just a fraction longer than usual. "Sophia Bennett," she answered, though he had already used her name, and he allowed the smallest hint of a smile to surface, not in amusement, but in quiet acknowledgement, as if he understood the formality for what it was, a boundary, a habit, a way of keeping control in spaces where it could easily be taken. "You handled yourself well earlier," he said after a brief silence, not referencing specifics, not naming names, but the meaning was clear, and Sophia's expression did not change, her composure unbroken. "I was simply here for my son," she replied, and he studied her for a second, not with judgment, but with a kind of measured attention, as if he were observing something that did not align with expectations he had not yet shared. "Of course," he said, his tone softening slightly, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them comfortable in its quiet, unlike the charged silences she had grown used to. And somewhere across the room, Ryan's voice rose again, drawing attention as he laughed with a group of donors, his presence still commanding, still familiar, but no longer as absolute as it had been at the start of the evening, and Ethan's gaze followed the sound briefly before returning to Sophia. "These events tend to reveal more than they intend to," he said, almost to himself, and Sophia considered that, her eyes steady. "Only if you are paying attention," she replied, and for the first time, something shifted in his expression, not surprise, but recognition, as if a piece of a larger picture had just come into focus, and though nothing about their exchange was dramatic, nothing loud or overt, there was a quiet sense that something had begun, something subtle but undeniable, like the first movement of a change that would not announce itself until it was already complete. The air between them did not demand urgency, it allowed space, the kind that most people rushed to fill, but neither of them did, and for a brief moment, the noise of the ballroom seemed to fade into something distant, something less important, as if their quiet exchange existed slightly outside the rhythm of the evening. Sophia shifted her weight subtly, her attention steady but not fixed, aware of him without giving more than she chose to, and Ethan seemed to understand that without needing. It explained, his presence never pressing, never intruding, simply there. "Do you attend these events often?" he asked after a moment, his tone conversational, but there was a layer beneath it, something more observant than casual curiosity. And Sophia gave the smallest shake of her head. "Not anymore," she replied, and the words carried no bitterness, no regret, just a simple acknowledgement of distance, of a life she had stepped away from without looking back, and he studied that response for a second, as if weighing what it did not say as much as what it did. "And yet you chose to come tonight," he said, not as a question, but as a recognition of intent, and she glanced briefly toward her son, who was now animatedly talking with another child, his hands moving as he described something only he found important, and her expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Some things are worth showing up for," she answered, and Ethan followed her gaze, nodding once, as if that answer confirmed something he had already begun to suspect. Across the room, Ryan's laughter rose again, louder this time, drawing a few more people into his orbit, his confidence unbroken on the surface, though his attention flickered more often than before, searching, recalibrating, and when his eyes landed on Sophia once more, he noticed something new, not in her posture, not in her expression, but in the fact that she was no longer alone in the way he had expected. His gaze lingered just long enough to register Ethan's presence, the unfamiliar figure standing beside her, and there was a brief pause in his expression, a hesitation so slight it would have gone unnoticed by anyone not looking for it, before he turned back to his conversation, dismissing it outwardly, though the thought had already settled somewhere deeper. Back near the edge of the ballroom, a server passed by with a tray of sparkling water, and Ethan reached for 2 glasses, offering one to Sophia without comment, the gesture simple, unassuming, and she accepted it with a quiet nod, their fingers not quite touching, the distance maintained with an ease that suggested intention rather than accident. "You seem unaffected by all of this," he said after a moment, his gaze moving briefly across the room, taking in the polished surfaces, the curated interactions, the subtle hierarchies that defined spaces like this, and Sophia considered the question, not rushing to answer, as if measuring the weight of it before deciding what it deserved. "I used to think this was everything," she said finally, her voice calm, reflective, "but it turns out, it is just a room," and there was no defiance in her tone. No attempt to diminish what it represented, only a quiet clarity that stripped it of the power it once held over her. Ethan's expression shifted slightly, something like respect settling into the space between them. "Most people never reach that conclusion," he replied, and she allowed the faintest hint of a smile, not for him, not for the room, but for herself, for the distance she had traveled without needing anyone to witness it. And as the evening continued to unfold around them, there was a growing sense, subtle but undeniable, that the balance of attention, of perception, of quiet influence was beginning to move in ways that could not yet be fully seen, but would soon become impossible to ignore. The room had shifted again, though no one had announced it, no music had changed, no lights had dimmed, and yet something in the atmosphere carried a quiet tension, the kind that builds not from noise but from awareness. And Ryan felt it before he fully understood it, standing near the center of the ballroom with a glass in hand that he had stopped drinking from, his attention no longer anchored to the conversation in front of him but drifting, pulled back toward the edge of the room where Sophia stood, not alone, not isolated, but composed beside a man Ryan did not recognize, and that detail, small as it was, unsettled him more than he expected, because it did not fit into the version of her he had been presenting all evening. And without excusing himself, he let the conversation around him fade, his steps measured as he moved across the floor once more, each stride carrying the same confidence he had relied on before, but now with a sharper edge beneath it. And when he reached them, he did not hesitate. "Sophia," he said, his tone controlled, though slightly tighter than before, and his gaze flicked briefly to Ethan before returning to her. "You seem to be enjoying yourself," and the words were neutral on the surface, but the implication beneath them carried a familiar weight, one that had once been enough to provoke, to unsettle, to draw a reaction. But Sophia did not shift, did not adjust. She simply met his gaze with the same calm she had carried all evening. "I am here for my son," she replied, her voice even, and beside her, Ethan remained still, his presence quiet but unmistakable, observing without interrupting, and Ryan let out a small breath that almost resembled a laugh, though it lacked warmth. "Of course you are," he said, nodding slightly, still keeping things simple. And there it was again, the subtle dismissal, the quiet attempt to frame her within limits he could understand, and for a brief second, the air between them tightened, the surrounding conversations dimming as if the room itself leaned in without realizing it, and Sophia felt it, the expectation, the unspoken anticipation that something sharper would follow, that she would respond, defend, clarify, but instead, she reached for her glass, taking a small sip before lowering it again, her movements unhurried, unaffected, and when she looked back at him, there was nothing in her expression that invited conflict, only a quiet certainty that made his words seem smaller than he intended them to be. "Simple does not mean small," she said, her tone soft, almost reflective, and the sentence did not land like a challenge, it settled like a fact, one that did not require agreement to exist, and for a moment, Ryan had no immediate response. The rhythm he had relied on disrupted in a way he could not easily correct, and his attention shifted again, this time more directly toward Ethan. "I do not believe we have met," he said, his voice regaining some of its composure, though the question beneath it was clear, and Ethan inclined his head slightly, his expression calm, Unreadable. Ethan Blake, he replied, offering nothing more. No explanation, no elaboration, just the name, and Ryan repeated it silently, as if testing it for recognition. But there was none, and that absence of context seemed to bother him more than anything else, because it left him without control, without a way to place the situation back into something familiar, and around them, the room continued to move. Conversations rising and falling, glasses clinking, laughter echoing in distant corners, but within this small space, the tension held steady, quiet but undeniable, and Sophia remained exactly where she was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, simply present, her composure intact, her silence no longer something to fill, but something that reshaped the moment itself, and for the first time that evening, it was not her who seemed out of place, but him. The room held its breath in a way no one consciously noticed, a collective stillness settling over polished floors and quiet conversations as the host glanced once more at her tablet, her smile widening just slightly as if she understood the weight of what she was about to say. This year, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the soft hum of the ballroom. Our program was made possible by an extraordinary contribution, one that did not seek recognition, but certainly deserves it, and a ripple of polite applause followed, brief and expectant, as eyes turned toward the stage, toward the promise of a name, a figure, a person who would fit neatly into the structure everyone understood, and Ryan straightened subtly, his posture aligning with anticipation, because moments like this had always belonged to people like him, people who stood at the center, who were called forward, who were known, and yet something in the air felt different, something he could not quite place, as if the script had shifted just enough to unsettle him without revealing why, and beside Sophia, Ethan remained still, his gaze forward, his expression unchanged, and there was a quiet certainty in the way he stood, not waiting, not wondering, simply existing within a moment he had already stepped beyond, and Sophia noticed that, not as a detail to question, but as something that aligned with everything else she had come to understand without needing it explained. And then the host continued, her voice steady. We would like to recognize not only the organization behind this generosity, but also the individual whose vision made it possible, she said, pausing just long enough for the room to lean in, for anticipation to sharpen into focus. Mr. Ethan Blake, and the name moved through the crowd like a subtle shock, quiet at first, then widening, conversations halting mid-sentence, expressions shifting as recognition began to surface, not universal, but enough to change the way people looked, the way they stood, the way they understood the space they were in, and Ryan's expression did not collapse, it held, but something behind it faltered, a fraction of a second where certainty gave way to realization, and he turned, slowly, toward the man standing just beside Sophia, as if confirming what he had just heard, as if the distance between assumption and truth needed to be physically closed, and Ethan did not move immediately, allowing the moment to settle, allowing the room to catch up, before stepping forward with the same quiet composure he had carried all evening. No rush, no performance, just presence, and as he walked toward the stage, the applause grew. Stronger now, more genuine, shaped by understanding rather than obligation, and Sophia remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, watching not with surprise, not with pride that needed to be displayed, but with a quiet acknowledgement of something that had never needed to be proven, and Ryan stood still, the noise around him fading into something distant, because in that single moment, everything he had constructed about the evening, about her, about the balance of power, shifted without asking for permission, and he saw it clearly now, not in what Ethan represented, not in the title or the recognition, but in the fact that Sophia had known, or perhaps more importantly, had not needed to know, had not needed to use it, had not needed to rely on it to stand where she stood, and that realization settled deeper than any public embarrassment could have, because it was not loud, it was not humiliating in the way he had intended for her, it was quiet, undeniable, and entirely his to carry. And as Ethan reached the stage, offering a brief nod of acknowledgement, his gaze moving once across the room before settling for the smallest fraction of a second on Sophia. There was no grand gesture, no declaration. Just a moment of recognition that existed without needing explanation, and Sophia responded in the only way she ever had, by remaining exactly who she had become, steady, composed, untouched by the need to prove anything at all. And as the applause filled the room once more, louder now, more certain, she reached for her son's hand, her fingers wrapping gently around his, and when she turned to leave, she did not look back, because she did not need to. The moment had already said everything, and somewhere behind her, in the space she had once occupied, silence lingered in a way that no words could replace, a quiet understanding that the strongest victories are the ones that never ask to be seen, only to be lived.